Welcome to the modern medicine movement. Woo! Let's go! All right. Welcome, guys. Dr. Thomas Hemingway here. Super pumped, super grateful. So excited to be here with you. Oh my gosh, what a crazy couple of days. Many of you guys know that my wife and I, Brooke, were just in Portugal, which is an incredible country. And don't worry, we'll be back. Had kind of a sketchy last day there, as some of you may have seen on Facebook. I had a guy fall right in front of me surfing while I was paddling out, and his board was getting tossed around in the whitewash as I was duck diving, and his board whacked me and literally got stuck in my hand. I had to literally pull the thing out of my hand, which was pretty gnarly, and sustained a pretty significant injury, which it's not awesome, but it just, I guess, comes with the territory. There's always some potential risk. I've been surfing for 35 years and never had something that bad happen. I've had mostly lacerations on my feet, usually caused by the reef or occasionally from a fin or something. And nothing, knock on wood, nothing on my hand until now. And whew, glad that's over with. Hopefully it's a one and done. And right now of just trying to heal up and optimizing my healing potential. We'll actually talk a little bit about that today. One of the things that goes with our theme for today, we'll actually talk a little bit about immunity, though that's not the focus of this podcast. It's on one of the questions that you guys asked. And so I can throw in a little corollary to how it affects immunity, which I will do, because I think immunity and just your overall immune function, being able to heal and also fight disease, is super important. So I'll tie that in here. But anyway, just wanted to once again thank you guys for being a part of the movement, the modern medicine movement. And, one of the things I just really, really love, and I hope you guys will all do this, literally it just takes seconds, maybe 30, 60 seconds to write a quick review, and it just helps so much. It helps move the needle in the space and get the podcast out there and known and become more discoverable and more easy for people to find. And that's one of the best ways to do it. So if you have not already written a review, please do so. I may even share yours right here on a podcast. And so I'm going to do that with Megan, who looks like is probably a dietitian, Megan RDH. She just wrote me a review a couple of days ago, and she says, and entitles it, "Highly recommend," with 5 stars. So guys, it's easy to find, especially it's on Apple. You just scroll down and you see the stars, click on the one farthest to the right, and then right above that, there's a little box with a little kind of pencil coming out the top. Click on that and write a review. And Megan says, "Dr. Hemingway is down to earth with practical action steps for improving your overall health and preventing disease. Each episode tackles a different topic with enough science for the nerds, but not so much that you feel the need to take notes. I love listening on the way to work." All right, Megan, RDH, thank you for that review. So appreciate you. I do this for you, Megan, and for all you guys and gals that are interested in improving your health, optimizing the health of your body, your mind, your spirit, your soul, your immune system, all of that good stuff, and doing so naturally, which is my emphasis, because I really believe that there is a way we can do this naturally. I love the philosophy, prevention over prescription, as you know, and as a medical doctor, I can't say that all of my colleagues think similarly. I think the prescription is their number one priority most of the time, and I, by all means, am happy to write a prescription if it is indicated, if it is necessary, but try to avoid at all costs if it is not indicated or necessary, because there are so many potential downsides, right? If you've ever gotten a prescription and you've been given the package insert from the pharmacist, there's 100 plus side effects to every medication out there, and so you gotta weigh the odds of if it's going to be worth the potential risk. So anyway, this is not meant to dive into the prescription, whole debate, because there are definitely some times when they're necessary, but oftentimes they are not, and still prescribed for many reasons. And we're not going to get into that today, but definitely talk with your doctor about whatever prescriptions you may be on to see if they're absolutely necessary, and see if there may be an alternate way to get the same effect, be it through natural means, be it through diet, supplementation, exercise, better sleep, better stress management, whatever it may be. And feel free to join us in the movement, the Modern Medicine Movement. We have a free Facebook group, as you guys know, the Modern Medicine Movement Health and Wellness Group. We have an amazing, amazing new Thrive community, Thrive with Dr. Thomas, which is kind of a VIP group that you guys will get much more focused attention. In fact, my next podcast is coming from the Thrive group members. It's an Ask Me Anything podcast, and they were able to submit their questions, and I will be answering them on the next podcast. So if you want to get your chance to be able to do that on our next episode, that is a Ask Me Anything, please, please, please jump into our new community, which is incredible. We have weekly trainings. We have live Zoom calls, all kinds of deep dive information. They can literally message me with questions, and I would love for you to have the opportunity. It's literally at a half price discount at the moment, super, super low cost, literally the cost of a couple of, of your favorite coffees a month, or going out to eat once, and if it's taking your significant other out to eat, it's, a dinner to Chipotle or something is all that it'll cost to get you into this Thrive community. So it's not much. It's super, super tons of value for a low price. I'd love to have you there. So check out the link in the show notes. You can take a look also on my Instagram at Aloha Surf Doc. I have a link tree there, which has a link to the group, the Thrive community. I hope you will join us. It's an amazing group. Oh my gosh, so much value there. So anyway, without further ado, today's episode also is from one of the members of our Thrive community that asked me a question. And so I just want to be able to not only ask, or I should say answer the question that I was posed in our Thrive community, but I wanted to give you guys also the benefit of hearing the answer. And it's some good information. Once again, Dr. Thomas Hemingway here. So grateful to be here with you on this episode to share an answer to a question I received in our very own Thrive community. And that question had to do with calorie restriction. One of the people in the group asked me, hey, my doctor has these thoughts on caloric restriction, and that's the only way to lose weight, and kind of this ultimatum kind of thing. And this particular doctor gave this gal a specific number that she had to meet with respect to caloric restriction. Who knows how he or she came up with this number? It didn't look like, from my understanding, it was based on any kind of science, which is often the case, that these numbers are just kind of thrown out there. And she was not only a little discouraged, but was a little confused, because she's been also following me and listening to the podcast. And she's heard me talk a lot about all different topics about what we should eat, when we should eat it, and do calories matter, and all this kind of stuff. And so she had a lot of questions. And so I just wanted to podcast today with an emphasis on what the heck this whole business of caloric restriction is, and does it have a role? Does it have a place? Is it something we should be doing? If so, is it something we should be doing a little, a lot? What are our goals? Are we trying to achieve weight loss? Are we just trying to achieve optimal health? What is it? We're going to get into it, because it's quite an issue, caloric restriction, or just calories in general. I think you guys may have heard me talk about this in the past, but it's a very intriguing concept. And I'm not going to get in super, super deep in the weeds on the history, but literally, if you want to take a deep dive on this, you got to join the group, Thrive Community. We will be talking in detail about this in the future. But let me just give you a quick sort of Reader's Digest version of this, which is basically a calorie. It is not a dietary principle. It really has nothing to do with human physiology. I hate to say it, although it is applied to our metabolism and physiology sort of in a backwards way, in the sense that it's a scientific principle that basically just applies to physics and, experimental concepts, in the sense that it's the amount of energy required to raise, a certain unit of water, a kilogram of water, 1 degree Celsius. So it's the amount of energy required to raise a certain amount of water, which is 1 kilogram of water, 1 degree Celsius. So you increase the temperature by 1 degree in this amount of water, and that's the definition given to the calorie. That's it. And so it's basically a measurement when you are doing an experiment in science. And when they originally decided they were going to try to apply this to human, dietary physiology, in other words, looking at things like proteins and fats and carbohydrates, they did all kinds of experiments in this device called the BOMB, B-O-M-B, the BOMB calorimeter. And essentially this is where they would take a food substance and literally incinerate it, burn it with flames, fire, and then the amount of heat that it gave off in that, experiment, when they burned whatever food stuff they were wanting to measure, it gave off a certain amount of heat, and that certain amount of heat raised the temperature of water, and they gave that a value. And so that's kind of how they determined 1, gram of, for example, fat is about 9 kilocalories, right? We measure usually with a big C, or kcals, 9, and proteins about 4, and carbohydrates about 4. And that was determined by literally burning these foodstuffs, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, these macronutrients, burning them in this BOMB calorimeter. So anyway, if you think that sounds a little weird, well, join the club. That really doesn't make any kind of sense in a physiologic sort of mechanistic way, because in our body, we're not igniting or incinerating food and burning it in this fashion, in a vacuum, so to speak. We're not doing that. Like, food is not just energy, quote unquote, although it is a part of our energy, right? But it's information. And we just don't, it's not black and white like this. We don't burn it like they do in a science lab, and it doesn't generate heat in that same way. It's a totally different process. It's a physiological process that's way more complicated. And so this whole concept of the calorie, as it came from the world of physical science, back in the times of the early steam engines, for example, when they were generating heat from the steam, that they were using to power these locomotives, the original ones, they were using this concept, and they just decided, hey, we'll apply this to human physiology, although we don't have any reason to suggest that it actually works this way, but we'll just do it. And so the original experiments were done, and then a guy by the name of Atwater, he jumped in and he said, hey, why don't we, assign these values to the proteins, the carbs, and the fats, and we'll just kind of use that. And crazily enough, this was in the 1800s, literally, and we are still using this outdated technique even today to put nutrition labels on our food that say such and such has X amount of calories, and it's not based on any real physiologic, human experiments. Like, it doesn't even relate to human physiology in such a way as you would believe it might be, because it's, for a lot of people out there, registered dietitians, some of them, and many doctors, they use this as the quote unquote Bible, whatever it says on that nutrition facts label, that such and such has X, Y, or Z calories. And trust me, I look at labels, but mostly to see what are the ingredients, what is actually in the food that I'm going to consume, because, I have this 5 ingredient rule, and I try to eat things that only have ingredients that I recognize, that are very simple, that are natural, that aren't, things that I might find in a chemistry lab. I don't even really pay attention to the calories. In fact, I almost never look at calories on any kind of label, because I just am not concerned about calories. Calories in, calories out. It just hasn't really been well shown and proven to be a really important factor in human health. And in fact, if anything, I would propose that people who are focusing, all this time, attention, labor into the calorie are really missing the boat, because first and foremost, what matters the most, and you can quote me on this, according to Dr. Hemingway, he says the quality of our food matters more than the calories in our food. Let me say that again. The quality of our food matters much more than the calories in our food. And I really think that that is borne out. It's something that is primordial, top, high level, interest. It should be the number one thing that we pay attention to, is not so much the number of calories. Like I said, I never count calories ever. I pay attention first and foremost to the quality and the source of my food. Where does it come from? Where was it raised or grown? Was it, hopefully done naturally in the most natural way without pesticides? If it happens to be an animal product like eggs or goat cheese or whatever else, that these animals were treated well, fairly raised in their own respective optimal environments, eating the things that are appropriate, species specific. Usually it's grass. We should be eating grass-fed, grass-finished meats and free-range chicken that are able to eat the things that chickens normally would eat, not things with, seed oils and other things that they were not supposed to be eating. And so the quality is the number one thing. Quality and the source of our food matters more than anything, way more than the calories. And let's talk a little bit about calories. This whole notion of calories in, calories out. Like I said, it makes sense in sort of the closed vacuum of science, but it does not make sense in human physiology, because we are not bomb calorimeters. We may be the bomb because we're awesome, and each one of you are awesome, amazing humans, but we are not a bomb calorimeter when it comes to how our body utilizes food. Food is more than just a fuel. Food is information. Food can turn on and off genes. It's not just a certain number of calories. And so, like I said, if you want a deep dive on that, we have much more on that in our Thrive community. Today, I just wanted to talk about it, how it relates to our body weight and to our metabolism, because so many people out there are so confused about this topic, and they've been told that in order to lose weight, you have to limit your calories or limit them extremely by severe caloric restriction. And there is a place for some caloric restriction here and there, and we'll talk about that. But unfortunately, the most common thing that happens with significant caloric restriction, and this is really what is the most common thing used when people are trying to diet to lose weight. Some form of caloric restriction is usually sort of the number one thing people are trying to accomplish when they are doing weight loss. And it has a lot of potential negative side effects. And we'll get into what I mean by that. There are some benefits to some forms of caloric restriction, but these are not extreme, okay? We're not talking about extreme. Some doctors tell their patients that you have to keep your daily calories down below 1,000, or even sometimes they're using numbers like 500 and 600, which I don't know where they're coming up with these numbers, but there's some danger to that. There's definitely some problems with severe caloric restriction, especially if it's utilized as a long-term approach. And we'll talk about what that means. There are benefits to kind of some mild caloric restriction, because I feel like especially I'll just speak for the Western, folks out there like me, coming from, North America, from the US. Actually, I'm coming from way, way, way out west, Hawaii. But in general, our Western diet, or what I call the SAD diet, the standard American diet, unfortunately, in general, we do consume more calories than we need. So I'm all about bringing that number down a little bit, but not to extreme levels of caloric restriction, like 500 or 600 calories a day, unless that's, just a very once in a while thing you're doing as a fasting, which is super great for the body. I do, or have done, I should say, many podcasts on intermittent fasting. So I'm not talking about that today, okay? But I do generally believe that we in the Western world, in the U.S. in particular, can afford to cut back on our total number of calories per day, but we're not talking about severe restrictions here. We could probably cut back by maybe 15 or 20%, because most of us do consume more calories than we probably need. And we'll kind of get to a little bit of the nuance of that today. The principle I like to use is one that comes from the Japanese culture, which is sort of one of their mantras, which is we shouldn't really eat until we are full. We should just eat until we were, sort of 70 or 75% full. Don't eat until you're like, oh my gosh, I got to like unbutton the top top button of my pants or, loosen up my belt because I'm so dang full, like kind of Thanksgiving Day full. Like we shouldn't be eating to that degree on a regular basis. We should eat until we're satisfied, but not necessarily until we're like, oh my gosh, my stomach feels like it's up here. My diaphragm, when I take a deep breath, it's like, oh my gosh, hard to do. Like we shouldn't be eating until we're full. We should only eat until we're, partly or maybe 70% full, which is kind of this, I forget the name of it. I'll post it up later in the show notes, but the name escapes me. The Japanese have a word for this, just eating until you're, partially full, like 70% full instead of until you're bursting at the seams kind of full. And they have a name for that. And that has been one of the keys to their not only longevity, but their health, at least prior to being exposed to our SAD diet, our standard American diet or the Western diet. Once they got a hold of that, they started eating all of our processed foods, seed oils, and their obesity, has changed a lot because they used to be real thin and healthy. And now those that have access to the quote unquote American diet, are not as healthy as they used to be. So in any case, I got a little bit off track, but what I wanted to say with respect to calories is that in general, I really do feel like we could come down by maybe like 15%, maybe even 20% on our general intake for the Western world, because we are tending to be humbly what I would describe as overfed and undernourished. In other words, we tend to eat a little bit more calories than we really need, but in those calories, we don't have enough nutrition. And that's part of the reason, because our bodies are literally starving for nutrition. Like if we're eating, the studies show, and this is the data, that we as North Americans or Westerners tend to eat 60% of our diet from processed foods. And these are like not the foods that I'm proud of. These are things that come obviously with a label, in a bag, or in a box with a barcode. So the 3 B's that I'm telling you guys to try to avoid, the things that come in a bag, a box, or with a barcode, these are things that have highly processed flours, sugars, grains, these super highly processed carbohydrates. Many of them come with the seed oils that are literally hidden in plain sight. If you don't know what the seed oils are, please go back and re-listen to my recent podcast on the seed oils, which I delineate, the top 8 that we got to avoid that are so pervasive. They're in almost everything. These things are literally toxic, and they not only are super inflammatory, but may be at the root of a lot of chronic disease and even potentially cancers and things. They're bad. So we got to avoid those. And the trouble is that many of us eat a lot of our diet from things that come out of a package. And I hope this isn't new to you, but most of those packaged foods are really not good. So we got to go back to the basics, go back to our roots, where we only ate things that were real, that we either picked from the tree, the bush, pulled out of the ground, tubers and roots and things, real food, real actual whole food. If we go back to that, we're going to not only be avoiding all of these sort of ultra processed things and ingredients and additives and other chemicals and food additives and things that are, although quote unquote grass, right, generally regarded as safe, that many of them have not been well studied and are likely contributing to our demise and our chronic health issues. So we got to go back to the basics, go back to real whole food. But what I wanted to say with respect to that is, generally speaking, we can all afford to, come down a little bit on the calories because we tend to be, as a society, overfed and undernourished. But what I wanted to say is that this is a cyclical issue, and it kind of perpetuates itself. In other words, when we are eating these highly processed foods that don't have a lot of nutrients, that makes us almost crave more because they are not satisfying. They are not satiating, and they do not have the nutrients that we need. And so our body being, kind of low and deficient in the nutrients, if you will, like I said, we're calorically, overdoing it, or we are overfed, but we are undernourished because of the types of foods that we're eating, primarily these highly processed foods, which represent about 60% of our SAD diet, standard American diet, and they don't have a lot of nutrients in them. And so our body is still craving more, right? I mean, if you sit down and eat a bag of your favorite processed chips or crackers or popcorn or whatever that is, like, do you really ever feel full? Like, it's hard. I mean, you just want to literally sit down and eat the whole bag because they are not satisfying. They are not satiating. They do not have many, if any, significant nutrient value. to that. And so we are, as a society, overfed yet undernourished. And so getting back to this whole notion of the calories, we're often told that if we need or desire to lose weight, the only way to do that is through calorie restriction. And that's, not entirely true, in the sense that, more importantly, if we start eating whole food and we literally stop, if we get that 60% down to zero or almost no processed foods, you can almost eat as much as you want of real food, real whole fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, real, healthy proteins, be it from animal products, plant products, whatever you like, fish, whatever. If you're eating real whole foods, it's actually really, really hard to overeat. The reason for that is twofold. Whole foods tend to, let's just take the case of carbohydrates, for example, they tend to come with fiber. So if you are eating, plants like either fruits or vegetables, and you're eating them whole and they're not processed at all, you just literally buy them from the produce aisle or at the farmer's market or what have you, it's really hard to overdo it because they will satiate you. They're full of fiber. You can't eat like 20 pounds of salad. It just can't really be done. I've never seen it done. I certainly couldn't do it. I mean, it's hard to overeat when you're eating real food. Same goes for when you're adding in protein, like say fish or grass-fed beef or eggs or what have you, cheese. It's hard to overeat those as well because they are much more satiating. Protein is very satiating or satisfying, whereas the carbs, especially the highly processed ones that you get out of a bag or a box, are not. And you can sit down and eat the whole bag of whatever your favorite indulgence is, but you can't sit down and eat 3 pounds of ground beef, or a fish, or of, legumes that are protein containing, or nuts or whatever. You just can't do it because they're more fulfilling, satisfying, satiating, and so on and so forth. So getting back to this whole principle of caloric restriction and sort of counting calories, if you will, let's talk a little bit about where do these numbers even come up with? So how do we know how many calories we need in a day? Well, there's lots of online calculators, and they're not exact, but it's a good start, trying to determine what they call the BMR, or basal metabolic rate. And that has to do with your height, your weight, things like that, your average amount of movement or exercise that you do in a day, and so on and so forth. That's kind of getting to just a baseline number, whatever your BMR is, a basal metabolic rate. This can actually be measured as well. There's a couple ways that can be measured. They're not all super accurate. Probably the best, which is not accessible to most of us, including to me, it's this thing called doubly labeled water, it's a pretty interesting way to do it. In fact, there was a super interesting study. I have to share it with you because I just think it's so interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. It was a study that was done pretty recently. Let me just give you the side note here. Well, I guess wasn't that recent. It's been almost 10 years now, but for some reason it's only gotten traction. We're kind of slow adapters, especially, unfortunately, my colleagues in sort of the Western medicine arena. The studies show it takes almost 20 years for that science to get out to where it's being practiced in real everyday physician practice. So we're kind of slow adopters, most of us. I tend to be one of the quicker adopters because I just read all day long and I try to stay abreast of all these things. But in the PLOS One, the Public the Library of Science Journal 2012, there's a really interesting article called Hunter-Gatherer Energetics and Human Obesity. And this is super interesting because they take the average sort of Western lifestyle person that, generally speaking, we're overweight. Just in the U.S., for example, about 7 out of 10 of us are overweight to some degree. And then obese, it's, around 50 some odd percent. And it's sad. And the good news is we can change this. Okay. But we got to understand, a little bit of the physiology and how we do this. But what was interesting is these researchers compared the so-called BMR, the basal metabolic rate of the average Westerner, with the basal metabolic rate of a hunter-gatherer tribe called the Hadza, 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 okay? Not like Mazda. It's a little bit of a switch in the in the consonants there. It's H-A-D, Had, Za, H-A-D-Z-A. If you want to look it up, the Hazda, I'll put the show notes in there. And this is one of the few remaining hunter-gatherer tribes, which basically means that they do things like they did way back in the day. They literally go out and forage, look for berries, look for honey, look for big game, whatever they can hunt, and they just eat what they can find, dig up from the ground, tubers, berries they can get, honey they can get, and animals that they can hunt. That's what they eat. They don't grow crops, if you will. They don't eat any processed foods. They are literally hunters and gatherers. And so the majority of their day, as you might imagine, is spent looking for food. Like, they're very active. I think they, on average, walk 10 to 15 miles a day. And so it was interesting. The researchers thought, as many of us would, that their metabolic rate would probably be way higher than the average Westerner with a desk job that literally sits and doesn't move a lot over the course of the day. And they use this technique called doubly labeled water, which is actually a really good, high-quality technique. And they looked at their average energy expenditure, or basal metabolic rate, if you will, and they looked at that in kilocalories per day, and they compared it to the average Westerner. What was their energy usage, or what they call the total energy expenditure, or TEE, over the course of one day. And what they found was a little bit striking. In fact, they had to repeat it because they didn't really believe it at first. What they found was that the average hunter-gatherer person who walks 10 to 15 miles a day had almost the same total energy expenditure as the average Westerner that sat on his or her butt most of the day at an office job. And what's so interesting about this, even though they weren't expending a lot by walking or activities like the hunter-gatherers, they basically, in their bodies, they measured this later, or they looked at it, and what's not surprising is that the average Westerner had way more inflammation going on in their body, right? If we're sedentary, they say the new dictum is sitting is the new smoking, or whatever, because it's such a bad habit. If we sit all day, that's why I have a standing desk, or I improvise like I am right now. I'm actually standing podcasting with a cardboard box on my desk, and so it's raising the height of everything, my microphone, my computer, that sort of stuff. But anyway, what they found is that the total energy expenditure from one of these hunter-gatherers was basically equivalent to a Westerner, because a Westerner was burning through so much energy because of the inflammation that they had on a daily basis. And so inflammation is like a fire. It's like the fire, and it needs calories. It needs to consume energy. And so in any case, we're burning calories, but not really in the way that's effective, in the way that we want. So that's super interesting article, and I'll put that in the show notes. But basically, if we want to determine our caloric needs or requirements, so to speak, there's a lot of online calculators to determine this, the basal metabolic rate. And then you need to include the body requires some energy just for digestion. So the process of eating and metabolizing food takes energy as well. And then, of course, whatever physical activity we do over the course of the day requires some energy. So when those things are taken into consideration, sort of in general terms, we need to have enough, energy consumed from our foods to be able to maintain those three, different requirements, right? The basal rate, whatever the energy needed for digestion, and then the energy needed for physical activity. We need to maintain that, or we lose weight. And so it's okay if we have a little bit less calories coming in if we want to lose weight, but you have to be careful of how you do this, because if you severely limit your calories coming in other words, severe caloric restriction, say you're doing like 500, 600, or maybe even 1,000 calories a day, and your body needs about 2,000, there's going to be some sort of, what should we say, side effects, or, there's definitely going to be some issues that can happen. One of the most common ones, and one of the ones that most doctors are not even aware of, they literally don't know this for some reason or another, and this has been scientifically proven, is that when you significantly limit your caloric intake, limit calories, what happens is it slows down your metabolism. Why? Because if the body thinks that it's starving, it wants to literally hold on to that energy as well as it can, because it's sort of, if you want to say, over the years, over the millennia, we were designed basically to not die if food wasn't around, right? If we were hunting and gathering, we couldn't find anything from maybe a few days or maybe even a week or so. We didn't want to die, so we had a mechanism to where we would decrease our energy requirement so that we could live off of whatever fat storage we had at the time, to be able to hold us through, tide us over until we found the next hunt or the next, beehive with honey or whatever it was. And so our bodies are literally designed, if they're limited in calories, to hold on to the calories much more strongly. And so our metabolism gets reduced. So one of the biggest problems with, significant caloric restriction is that it actually lowers your metabolic rate. So a good example of this is, you guys have probably heard of that show called The Biggest Loser. And, they employed a lot of caloric restriction, also a bunch of exercise and things. So some good things, some not so awesome things. And what they found, which is not surprising, in the short term, when you calorically restrict yourself, you lose weight. Like, duh, that's easy. But over the long term, many of these people, in fact, the majority, gained a lot of that weight back for a couple of reasons. One, because their metabolism, as I mentioned, when you significantly restrict your calories, your metabolic rate lowers, it goes down. And they found that this persisted years later. In fact, there's a study in the journal Obesity from 2016, and I'll put this in the show notes. It's entitled Persistent Metabolic Adaptation 6 years after The Biggest Loser competition. So this metabolic adaptation is this lowering of the metabolic rate because of the caloric restriction. This thing persisted for, at least in this study, at least up to 6 years. And so they had 16 of these Biggest Loser competitors that they investigated, and they followed up with them over the years. And their weight loss, which in the end of the competition was pretty significant, right? It was over 100 pounds, but this decreased their metabolic rate significantly by, up to 600 or more calories per day. And even after 6 years, their resting metabolic rate was still on average, between 400 and 700 calories less per day up to 6 years later. So their metabolic rate, basically at the end of the, so many weeks of the competition, it was sustained, that low metabolic rate, for up to 6 years. So it was crazy. Like, this is not what you want, because when your metabolic rate is low, what happens is you basically hold on to that fat vigorously, and your chances of regaining that weight is going to be very, very high. In fact, you guys have heard me talk about this before. Anybody that's been following me, the most consistent prediction that happens with respect to people who regularly go on diets, basically all diets in the short term cause some weight loss, okay? In the end, in the long term, when you're looking at 1, 2 years, even longer later, the sad thing is the only thing that, repeated diets basically accurately predicts is future weight gain. Let me say that again. The only thing that accurately is predicted by somebody who's readily, and repeatedly going on diets for the future with respect to their future weight is it predicts future weight gain, 90 some odd percent. This has been borne out in lots of different research. There's a gal from UCLA that's looked into this in depth, and it's one of the sources that I have in my upcoming book. But she's looked at this in so many different ways, and basically it's really sad. When you're going on all these different diets, in the end, not only do you typically regain whatever that weight is, but often you overshoot and you gain even more. And part of the reason for that is because when you do caloric restriction, which is one of the most common techniques employed in dieting, you are kind of sabotaging your body in the sense that it's lowering the metabolic rate. And so it's very interesting. This study about the Biggest Loser competitors was pretty eye-opening to me, because I knew that this was a concept and that this existed, but I didn't realize it persisted for that many years later. This was 6 years later, their metabolism was still very, very slowed. And if you want to keep the weight off, that's going to be really, really hard, right? Really, really hard to do so if your metabolism is slowed down. So when I am coaching people on weight loss, we hardly even talk about calories. We do an initial evaluation just to get an idea of how many calories they're consuming, because it's good to get a baseline. and then also get a baseline of what their requirements are and so on. And like I said, in general, most of us could actually decrease our caloric intake daily by 10, maybe up to 20%, because generally speaking, we just overeat as a society. And so we could limit that. But when you go to these kind of severe caloric restrictions, you run the risk of lowering your metabolism, which none of us really want, right? So anyway, I hope this study gives you an idea of the persistent effect, which can be years later. And so those of you that have been on significant caloric restriction, if you had trouble keeping the weight off or you regained it, this is not your lack of willpower. It's not you not having sort of that mental fortitude or whatever. It's physiology. Your body is working against you, which is why I don't recommend these severe caloric restrictions, because they just don't work in the long term. Of course, in the short term, everybody can lose 10, 20, whatever, depending on where you start, 30, 40, 50 pounds over the first 6 months. But to keep that off is super difficult if your key mechanism was in significant caloric restriction. The other thing I don't like about severe caloric restriction is that when you lose a bunch of weight quickly, what often happens, especially if you're reducing your calories significantly, is that you're losing some fat, but typically this is coupled with a lot of muscle loss. And when you lose muscle, it is not good, because you know what the most sort of metabolically active tissue in the body is? Well, duh, big surprise, it's the muscles, right? The muscles are the most metabolically active. So the more muscle mass that you have, the better your metabolism. If you lose a bunch of muscle mass, that's going to really hurt you in the end for a lot of reasons. But one is just that it's going to be more difficult to keep the weight off, because your muscle is the most metabolically active tissue in your body. So what's interesting, besides doing what I always like to share is, kind of the holy grail of physical activity, is sort of resistance training, which is super important. And that's anything that involves any kind of weight. It can be lifting weights. It can be using your body weight, with air squats, lunges, burpees. I love to do planks. You guys may know that. I think they're awesome. But these kinds of body weight activities that make the muscles fire, resistance training is super important to not only maintain, hopefully we all can maintain, but even build muscle mass, which is not really easily done through just simple cardio, if you're just going for cardio type physical activity, which is great, but it's not enough. You got to do some kind of resistance training. So once again, a big problem with caloric restriction when you lose a bunch of weight quickly is that often you're going to lose muscle mass as well. And that is not what you want. One way to kind of prevent that is when you do limit your calories, which many of us can do to some degree because just naturally in the Western world, we overeat, is to, when we decrease our total calories that we eat, we need to make sure we have a significant amount of protein in there. And in fact, protein is the upcoming topic of the month of May in our Thrive community. And all things protein we're going to get into, so I hope you'll join me. Protein is a fascinating macronutrient. Super important, super healthful. Not only is it much more satiating and will quell our hunger, but it's super important for the body. And if you're trying to lose weight, it's actually really important that you eat protein, because you don't want to lose muscle mass. And like I said, we'll get into that in the Thrive community this month, but just take it from me that protein's super important. I kind of use the mantra, the power of protein, protein power, activate, if you guys ever watched that cartoon from the past. But protein, we need to prioritize. We really need to prioritize it in our diet. And if you're looking to lose weight, I would humbly suggest that protein requirement even goes up, because you really want to focus on a couple of the benefits of protein, which is you want to maintain at a minimum your muscle mass. You don't want to lose any of it, because like I said, every bit that you lose, your metabolism goes down, and that's not a good thing. If anything, you want to do exercises while you're trying to lose weight that would build your protein, build your muscle mass, which would be some resistance training. And when you're doing that, there's actually some interesting studies. In fact, I will share one with you here, which I found super, super interesting. Let me just find it here for you, which talks about how protein intake when you're doing some caloric restriction should even be increased rather than decreased, which is super interesting because you're decreasing your overall amount of calories per day, but you're actually increasing your protein, because typically when we're trying to lose weight, we're going to have some kind of exercise in there as well. Hopefully there will be some resistance training. And this is a study from the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism 2014. And it's entitled A Systematic Review of Dietary Protein During Caloric Restriction in Resistance Trained Lean Athletes, a Case for Higher Intakes. And so this was super interesting because what they found is that when they were, these are folks that say they have to be in a certain window, say it's for wrestling or, you're in a weight category. There's often a rush to lose some weight, right before an event or whatever to meet a certain weight requirement, things like that. But what they found is that it was very important not only to maintain protein intake, but to actually increase it when their goal was some version of caloric restriction. In fact, the conclusion, let me just read it for you. Protein needs for this decreased calorie resistance trained athlete are likely even higher, between 2.3 and 3.1 grams per kilo. So typically I recommend a minimum 1 to 2 grams per kilo of protein daily, but they were all the way up to over 3 grams per day if you're calorically restricting yourself. So that's a lot of protein. And like I said, we're doing a whole month on protein in the Thrive community, and protein is power. Protein is power. Protein needs to be prioritized. It is so dang important. And one of the biggest problems, like I said, with most caloric restriction is that we lose muscle mass. We lose it, and that's not good, okay? That is not good. Another problem with significant caloric restriction is that we are often not getting our bodies the amount of nutrients that we need. If we're just eating 500 calories a day, we're usually not going to get enough magnesium, for example, or zinc, or, protein for sure, because protein is at least 4, calories per gram. And we need to have sufficient protein so we don't lose muscle mass, right? Often when we limit our calories, we can be at a risk for decreasing levels of the B vitamins, right? Like thiamine, biotin, the A vitamins as well, because those come usually in the things that have protein, like meats and dairy and leafy greens and legumes and things like that. Magnesium, we can be at risk for deficiencies there. And already in our sort of overfed, undernourished Western diet, over 60% of us, most studies would report up to 70% are functionally deficient in magnesium. Magnesium is a mighty mineral. Check out my podcast that I did a whole hour on just magnesium. And so one of the big problems of severe caloric restriction, when we're trying to lose weight, is that we can get decreased nutrients. And when we don't have enough nutrients, what do? We crave more. We're more hungry for food, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. Also, there's a risk if we're not getting enough nutrients and we're calorically deficit, we can get weaker bones. We can have fertility issues. I'll just speak to this real quick. When we have caloric restriction in guys, their testosterone goes down, right? Their testosterone goes down, and that's important to maintain your muscle mass as well as your bones. You don't want low T, right? Well, caloric restriction can cause that also in a woman. It decreases the estrogen levels, and that can cause weakened bones and other issues, and increase risk of course, fractures and osteoporosis, osteopenia, all that sort of thing. The other thing it can cause when we restrict our nutrient intake because of our caloric restriction is decreased immunity. I kind of alluded to this in the very beginning. Immunity is our ability to stay healthy and fight infection, right? You guys have probably experienced this yourself. If you try to do too much, say aerobic exercise, and you're not feeding yourself enough, you're actually taxing your body and making yourself more prone to infection for actually 2 different reasons. One, if you're not taking enough in, right, your immune system needs those nutrients, right? It needs zinc, it needs selenium, it needs magnesium, it needs vitamin D. And if you're not getting enough of this stuff, you're more prone to infection. But also what happens is that when we're overworking ourselves, like say we're doing tons of cardio and we're restricting our intake, we're doing only 500, 600, maybe 1,000 calories a day, and our body actually needs 1,800 or something, and we're working out like crazy. What's going on there is that the body sees that as increased stress. It's like, oh my gosh, I need 1,800 calories a day, and they're only giving me 600 to 1,000, and they're doing all this exercise. We know that translates into, short-term weight loss, but long-term, it's a disaster. Not only does it upset this hormonal balance with respect to things like leptin, the satiety hormone, and ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and whatnot, but it also diminishes your immune function. It also puts you at risk for all these nutrient deficiencies, and it can make you more likely to get sick. There's a couple interesting studies that I was reading in preparation for this that were talking about, athletes that were trying to, do a whole bunch of cardio to lose weight, like prior to a competition or whatever. And they found that they had increased chances of infection, because they weren't getting enough calories and they were just kind of overdoing it. And this is likely caused by two things. One is the nutrient deficits because they weren't putting enough in, but also cortisol, the stress hormone, goes up when we kind of overdo it on the exercise end and we're not feeding our body appropriately on the front end. It actually, when cortisol is elevated, our immune function does the opposite. It goes down. Our immune function is compromised, if you will. So we need to have the right nutrients, the right amount of nutrients, and we can't just operate at a caloric deficit for any significant period of time. It's better to just start with what I always call rule number one, which is eat real food, whole foods, right? Things that come from the earth, the ground, or nature, and that are raised in the appropriate way, That is first and foremost. And if we eat whole foods, we're going to be less likely to be hungry all the time. If we eat those sort of empty calories that come from the classic standard American diet, which are 60% processed foods, we're going to be hungry all the time, So eat real food, daily movement or daily exercise. And if you really want to lose weight, this will happen with the combination of eating real food and kind of taking a look. We got to take a look at what we're consuming because we want to make sure we're getting enough nutrients. If we're not getting enough nutrients, our body will crave, right, the nutrients. And when it craves, it wants us to eat more and more. And especially if we're not feeding it things that are nutrient dense, we're going to be hungry all the time. And so the key, often people say, oh, when I'm on the diet, I'm just hungry all the time. You shouldn't be if you're eating the right foods. And if you're eating, a good percentage of protein, which is a key macronutrient for all of us, but especially if we're trying to lose weight, because a protein not only will satisfy you, you won't be hungry, but it'll help you to preserve your muscle mass, which is sort of your secret weapon when it comes to metabolism. The most important thing of all, right? The most important organ in our body with respect to metabolism is our muscle mass. And if we're losing muscle mass, which all of these biggest loser people pretty much lost muscle mass, and almost anybody who goes on a severe caloric restriction will lose muscle mass. And so it's literally, I hate to say it this way, but you're stabbing yourself in the foot with respect to long-term health and preventing the weight gain, because when you decrease your muscle mass, you're going to be way more likely to gain weight in the future for a couple of reasons. One, your metabolism is going to be slowed down, right? Also, when you do severe caloric restriction, just in and of itself, the body naturally over thousands of years has adopted mechanisms to try to hang on to those calories, more strongly, because it doesn't want to starve to death, and if it does that, it's going to make your chances of, keeping that weight off super challenging in the future. So you got to eat high quality foods. You got to get the nutrients that your body needs, and you got to incorporate protein into that regimen and do some resistance training to keep your muscle mass up. You want to keep your muscles. You want all those muscles. You need them, especially when you get to be my age, when you're in, your late 40s and 50s and beyond. Like, the path of least resistance is that we have what's called sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass. That's what happens to all of us unless we do something about it, unless we're proactive, unless we eat appropriate amounts of protein on a daily basis, and unless we do weight training or resistance training. And so if you guys want more on this, I have so much more for you. I hope that this was a nice precursor into a little bit of information on calories and what's the deal with caloric restriction and so on and so forth. There's just so many questions about this out there, and most doctors sadly don't really understand it. They just say, eat less calories, exercise more, and they're usually referring to cardio. And so that's not a great strategy. Yes, I think we can all afford to, decrease our calories a little bit because we tend to be overfed, but you need to make sure you're putting the right stuff in, the right percentage of healthy fats and carbs and protein. You got to prioritize protein because protein is power, and to activate it in your muscles is so key. We got to preserve that muscle mass, hopefully even increase it, because that is our secret weapon to be able to keep our metabolism boosted and working like it needs to just help us to be vital, to be energized, and to be able to lose weight if we need to, and to keep it off long term. You got to prioritize protein. So if you want more of that, please join our group, the Thrive Community. We have a whole month of nothing but protein. There's a lot of nuance to it, to the timing of it. How do you time it with respect to working out? How do you know how much you need? There's a lot of nuance. What's the best quality protein that your body can use and recognize and absorb? What's a complete protein? All these things we will answer. So please join us in the Thrive Community. The link will be in the show notes. And until next time, thank you, thank you, thank you. Love you all. And just big giant aloha.